Hi everyone, I'm Sandy Barker, author of romantic comedies set in gorgeous destinations, including the 5-book holiday romance series and my latest book, Match Me If You Can, which is the first book in the Ever After Agency series with Baldwood Books. I'm going to be joining V and Darren in the Writers' Lounge soon, and we are offering a copy of Match Me If You Can as a giveaway in the next Australian Book Lovers newsletter, so watch out for both of those coming soon.
Once upon a time. Welcome to Australian Book Lovers, your destination for imagination.
A big warm welcome to everyone and a huge thank you for joining us for the Australian Book Lovers podcast, episode 102. Our mission is to bring fabulous Australian and Indigenous literature that spans a whole range of genres to book lovers around the globe, as well as fantastic resources and information for passionate authors looking to write their next bestseller. I'm Veronica Strachan, aka VE Patton, fantasy, memoir and picture book writer, reader of many genres, and one of your co-founders and hosts, coming to you from Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country.
And I am Darren Kazuko, dystopian science fiction and horror author, avid reader, and your other host on the Australian Book Lovers podcast, coming to you today from Ghana country with another beautiful summer balmy afternoon. So loving seeing these blue skies. I know people in Queensland will be trying to remember what a blue sky looks like at the moment, but at least our summer's come. But yes, episode 102.
Indeed. It feels almost like a not a letdown, but it feels like anticlimax is the word that I'm looking for, and words is what we're all about, so I should be finding my words. But yeah, it feels like 102 is the anticlimax. We built ourselves up to 100, and then it's like, okay, 102, where we go?
Oh, that might be the equivalent of so the post 100 blues, like when when you come back from a holiday overseas and suddenly your normal life seems so boring. But that's not to say that episode 102 is boring in any way. No. We have a super cool interview with author Michael Buxton. I had the very cool pleasure of sitting down chatting with him all about his book 1964, and really some cool insights and chats about if you're into the 60s and the changes that was happening in Australia, and this guy's adventure's really good. So yes, 102, it's the beginning of the next century, so here we go again. But loving being here, 102. So it's we can shake the blues off. And would you like to know some Australian trivia?
Give me some trivia, Darren. Get me going. Yes, indeedy.
Okay.
What do you got?
All right. So, did you know that Australia has over 750 different reptile species, which is more than any other country in the world?
Not surprising.
That's pretty full on, actually, because as in, if I'd sit down with a pen and paper and I got asked to write down all the reptiles I know, it'd be like, okay, crocodile, blue tongue, frilled neck lizard, gecko, sleepy. But I wouldn't get to 100, let alone 750. All right. What are these creatures? Where are they? I don't want to see them all. So I think there should be reptile collector cards like the old movie cards. But anyway, but speaking of reptiles, well, I don't know if it's a reptile or not, but I didn't realise this. The world's oldest fossil, which was dated at approximately 3.4 billion, with a B for Bravo, billion years old. That was found in Australia, which is pretty cool.
Wow.
So I'm guessing maybe it was something to do with the inland sea that was around. I don't know. Beaches. Who doesn't love beaches, especially when we're talking about summer? This one is really interesting, but it's also a little bit sad. Kind of makes you sort of put things in perspective. Anyway, the theory goes that if you visited one new beach in Australia every day, it would take over 27 years to see them all.
Wow, that's a lot of beaches. We do have a lot of coastline.
Yeah, and I mean, I definitely don't see a new beach every day. So in essence, when I looked at that, I'm like, there are so many beaches I'll never get to see.
Oh.
So, yeah, and I love beaches.
Yeah, you do love beaches, yes.
Now, here's something I kind of knew about, but I've forgotten about. Apparently, we at one point we sent a platypus to England, I guess, back in the early settlement days, and they believed over in England when they received it, they thought that we were having a lark or playing a joke, and they thought we sewed the bill of a duck onto a rat.
Oh,
so
poor little platypus.
Yeah. So, and apparently the platypus has got enough poison or venom, should I say, that to kill a small dog. So didn't know they were like that. The Sydney Harbour Bridge, obviously very much an icon of Australia and an international symbol. So when it was officially opened, apparently a retired cavalry officer by the name of Francis de Groot stole the show. So when they were officially opening the bridge, and just as the Premier was about to cut the ribbon, this gentleman, Francis de Groot, charged forward. He was on a horse, and he had a sword, and he cut the ribbon himself with the sword.
Oh, really?
So there we go. Talk about stealing the thunder from the Premier. But that sounds like a much more spectacular way to cut the ribbon. But, of course, the ribbon had to be retied, and the cavalry officer, de Groot, he was carted off to a mental hospital and was later charged for the cost of one ribbon. So, yeah, not too bad a result there. Last little one. This one's I found quite fascinating, and I don't think I'd ever learnt this at school. And if I did, of course, I was probably chatting away at the back of the room. Apparently Chinese explorers have travelled to Australia long before the Europeans arrived. So as early as the 1400s, sailors and fishermen from China were visiting Australia for sea cucumbers and trading with the indigenous population. So
there you go.
Yeah, wow. So the Chinese really were already making friends and doing trade here. So because
we know the
I didn't know.
Yeah, the Indonesians we know were trading long before the Europeans. So yeah, it is that, as they say, history is written by the victor, and we're broadening our horizons a lot more.
Slowly, yeah. So there we go, just a bit of trivia for the episode 102. Yeah, we're learning more and more about Australia every episode.
Every time, indeed. And now we're going to learn a little bit more about fantasy. So taking this from Lisa Tuttle's book on writing fantasy and science fiction, I'm going to tell you about the types of fantasy. Heroic, of course, is also known as sword and sorcery, and this is often what people think of as the, fairly standard. It's the adventures of a hero or a heroine tending to survive, often to complete a task or tasks. So, you're going to find Conan stories, you're going to find Farad and the Grey Mouser books, and lots of sword and sorcery stuff about. Second one is epic or high fantasy, and while it's closely aligned to heroic fantasy, the main difference is that the longer epic fantasies put less emphasis on the hero or heroine figure. Instead, there's a really large cast of important characters, and the main protagonist is usually an ordinary person whom you wouldn't necessarily consider heroic. So tell me what you imagine as the classic example of epic fantasy with an ordinary hero.
I mean, when you talk about sword and sorcery and stuff, I guess back in time, ancient time comes to mind. Didn't read a great deal of them. I mean, I've got to admit, I was a fan of the what are they called, the sword and sandal movies.
Right.
Because a lot of the time there was a lot of nudity. So as a young fellow, it's like, so you had swords, you had violence, and of course, you had the nudity. But fantasy. I guess because when I hear the term fantasy, I'm always thinking more along the lines of bordering on sci-fi. Those epic multi-world fantasy. So like I said, with a whole ensemble cast of characters that that you jump around from. And of course, when I hear the term fantasy, I also think of series. It's very rare that you find a fantasy book that is just a standalone. Because you have. When I go looking for books and hunting the bookshops, secondhand books, you see these amazing covers and you grab it and go, oh, this looks spectacular. It's 1,000 pages. All right, wicked. And then you look at the fine print on the front and it's book 3 in the
Yes.
It's like, and there's
Or
never
they
the book one.
That's it. They've got book 2 and 4, and you go,
Yeah,
no, it's not fair.
exactly. Yeah.
Oh, well, there you go. All right, now, Lord of the Rings, of course, is epic or high fantasy,
of course.
with our friend Bilbo Baggins, the Hobbit, being one interesting. Now, who was I talking to the other day? Someone who'd done tours of New Zealand, where, of course, they filmed the Lord of the Rings, and somebody who hadn't read the book. Who was I talking to about that? Oh, some friends we were out at a dinner, and this person hadn't read the book either, but their partner had, and they were dead keen to go, so they went. And this person was chatting to the tour guide, and who had asked the group how many had read, and only about half the people had read the book. And so the person was talking to the tour guide and said, why do so many people come? What's the draw? And the tour guide said that lots of people believe that hobbits are real. They haven't read the book, but they've read the tour stuff. And so they're waiting for the hobbits. They think Hobbiton is a real place where hobbits really live.
Oh, Lordy.
Yes. Oh, Lordy was exactly that. We nearly fell off our stools laughing. But anyway, there you go.
Well, it could be said that there may be a faint but still nonetheless significant correlation between not choosing to read books and believing in the boogeyman.
Yes. Well, there you go. Mind you, I would love, of course, many of the fantasy books that I've read to be real or, in parallel universes or that. But no. Anyway. All right. Then we have dynastic fantasy, so dynasty. So these are an outgrowth of the epic or the heroic fantasies, and they take place over lots of years, and they fill a series of books. And so the Belgariad series by David Eddings, I don't know if you've read that.
No.
That's one of my faves. A Song of Fire and Ice, of course, George Martin's books, which were made into, what's the series, what do they call the series?
Oh, the Game of Thrones.
Yeah. Humorous fantasy, of course, is a very popular genre, but it's really hard to do. So Terry Pratchett, of course, is the master of this with the Discworld series, and really the readership has to be very familiar with what's being parodied. So the fantasist needs to kind of combine comedy and inventiveness with a well-told story, and it's not easy to do. So I just love the humorous fantasy is good. Jasper Ford is another one who does some great stuff. Then we've got dark fantasy, which might be something more around what you might have read, sometimes used as a more respectable term for supernatural horror fiction. But it also describes fantasies such as Stephen Donaldson's Covenant series, one of my favourite series of all time, in which a brooding sense of horror pervades the story. Vampire books. Are you much of a vampire fan?
I don't read it. Well, I was saying that. I was a big fan, or I am a big fan of Brian Lumley's Necroscope series, which is based around the One Theory, which is a very big scope vampire series that happens in modern day and then goes back to medieval days, and that's really cool. But I don't sort of seek out the vampire stuff only because it's got to be done really original, doesn't it? Like,
it does. We won't talk about sparkly vampires in the sun or that kind of thing. All right, let's move on, because of course in general occult, ghost and supernatural stories tend to be more towards horror than fantasy, but there is that kind of crossover with dark fantasy, so there you go. All right, magical realism is the third last one. So this is the posh end of fantasy, according to Lisa Tuttle, and it's usually published as mainstream literary fiction. And among its strengths are fine writing and fascinating characters. The plot may concern an inexplicable intrusion of the magical or otherworldly into otherwise ordinary lives. For example, the works of Angela Garrett, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and Alice Hoffman. So Alice Hoffman wrote Practical Magic. I'm not sure if you remember that, I think The Rules of Magic was the second one she wrote, and that, of course, was made into a movie with Sandra Bullock and Nicole Kidman, which is really good. That's one of my comfy ones. Put on in the background, do something else. So there you go.
I've always wondered when it comes to magic realism, because I love that term, I love the concept, but where is the defining line of magic? Because there is, when it comes to fantasy or supernatural and stuff like that, any story with somebody who might have some sort of power, is that technically magical realism? Well,
it can be, or it might slide into, it depends if the world is now. So usually sort of mainstream kind of most almost indistinguishable from our own, apart from, somebody has some powers or whatever. So, yeah, that's the magical realism.
Uh-huh.
All right. Time slip fantasies, of course, are fairly common. So in these, the characters from one era travel through time to have adventures in another. And time slip fantasies may be published as science fiction, like Robert Adams' Castaway in Time series, or Jack Finney's Time and Again, or alternatively, they may be marketed as romance, as with Diana Gabaldon's Outlander series, which of course was made into a really lengthy TV series, which I think I watched the first half of the first series, and then I thought, I'd moved on. That was enough for me. Final one is romantic fantasy, and this is aimed at it's recently developed into a new subgenre in the US, but also around the world, I think. So Harlequin, which is a brand name for popular romances, set up a list called Luna to publish science fiction and fantasy with strong feminine appeal. In the same year that Tor, another publishing house, established a paranormal romance program that includes science fiction, fantasy, horror, time travel, and alternate history in which a romantic storyline is crucial to the novel. So there's, quite a lot of writers they talk about there as well. So, yeah, romantic fantasy, it's okay, but if it's primarily, I think you've heard me say this before, the romance can be part of the storyline, but I'm not mad if it's just the storyline with a little bit of the other stuff happening there.
When I think of fantasy, especially the big multi-world scopes, or the, or for example, the sweeping epic like something like The Lord of the Rings, and never in my mind does it come to be that I think of it as a romance, as in the reason for, there's a lot of great literature out there where the romance or the rescuing of somebody or getting back with somebody, there's that big goal, there's the underlying tension, romantic tension, in adventure books and all that. But with fantasy, the romance is really not, in my head, it's not part of anything, because it's more about usually saving the earth or save.
Yes, there's a quest.
Yeah, it's a quest.
It's all more about the quest.
Yeah, as opposed to a love being the quest, or somebody being the quest. But yeah, there we go.
Yeah, I'm with you. So there you go. That is fantasy. So I will leave you to enjoy that and think about what you've been reading of late, if you're a fantasy reader. I've got 2 words for you, Darren, before we jump into our new little segment, which is a thesaurus. And I know we're trying to mix things up a bit, but I just thought I'd try and finish some of the beautiful words from Otherworldly by Yi Lam Mak and illustrated by Kelsey Garrity Riley. Okay, because uitwayen, which is a verb in Dutch, which is absolutely the most terrible pronunciation, and I apologise to anybody who says that I cannot believe that. How would you pronounce uitwayen? Uitwayen.
Yeah, Udva. I think it'd be like a V.
Udwayen.
Yeah.
Okay.
But being half Dutch, well, coming from mother side Dutch,
yes.
The only Dutch I have learned, I can say, is if there are any Dutch listeners that are not happy with the pronunciation, I'm sure they're saying "Godverdomme." So, which is usually, I remember that was followed by my name, and I knew I was in trouble. So,
okay.
But yes, I suspect the W would be pronounced a V, but I am far from a linguistics expert.
All right. I do like the verb, though, which is to take a break and walk away from the demands of life to clear one's head. Yeah, I really like that.
A definite requirement at some points.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hitting pause, really, isn't it?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And, you talked about the beach and heading down the beach and all those kind of things. That would be, nice to clear your head. And the second one is l'appel du vide, which is a noun phrase from French. L'apostrophe, next word, du, next word, vide. L'appel du vide. And it's literally the call of the void, the inexplicable draw of the dangerous and unknown future, the urge to throw oneself from safety into a gulf of an unexplored adventure, experience, or idea. And I thought, that is perfect for having just read about fantasy and the adventure. There you go.
Yeah, and I think those 2 words then have a bit of a relationship. One is pausing the world, and the other one is throwing caution to the wind and shaking the world up.
Indeed. So we've got a little challenge for each other, which is to talk about synonyms and look at words and, check out what other words we could say, because as writers, we have our favourite words and it's harder to think of something different or something more subtle. So rather than have your work peppered with 16 different words for rather than have back in your pages or in your chapter 16 times, what else could you put in? So tell me, Darren, what word have you chosen to educate us about today?
Well, my thesaurus word for episode 102 and the first little thesaurus segment, I had no choice. I had to go with the word fantastic because I'll give you now. But curiously enough, I was fascinated to know the origins of the word terrific. So essentially, terrific is like frightful and terrifying, and yet we use it as a it's terrific. It's like, well, that technically means it's scary, but I was surprised. The word fantastic now, you can have synonyms when fantastic is used as an adjective, as in strange, different, or imaginary. So leading towards that idea of fantasy, I suppose. Some pretty cool words: fanciful, grotesque, imaginative, implausible, incredible. Here's one that's really cool, and I'm going to definitely try and use it sometime. Phantasmagorical. That's a good one.
Wow.
Supposititious, freakish, hallucinatory, elusive, irrational, mad, misleading, nonsensical, out of sight, man. But that is when fantastic is used as an adjective, as in strange, different, or imaginary. But when using it as far as, wonderful, excellent, like, for example, we have a fantastic guest coming up, which I promise not to use that word fantastic anymore. So some different words that can be used instead of fantastic. They're not as cool as when you're using it as a strange or a little bit different meaning. But anyway, the thesaurus suggests words such as superb, unreal, delicious, awesome, first-rate, great, marvellous, sensational. So I reckon I've probably burned through a few of those already. It also suggests, I like these ones. These are considered weaker matches.
Right.
Best ever, far out, first class, like wow, out of sight again, out of this world. But here's the one that beats them all. The cat's meow. So,
there you go.
I don't know. Good. I'm going to try and use that one. I don't know how I can describe. We've got a cat's meow author coming up, but I'm going to try and use it. But so there we go. So fantastic can be used as a adjective for strange and different or imaginary, and that comes with some pretty cool words. So ludicrous and grotesque and far-fetched. So there we go. A little bit of an insight into options when it comes to not wanting to use the word fantastic 75 times like I absolutely do, subconsciously, unconsciously, or however you want to put it. What word have you selected?
Well, mine was a little bit of a mea culpa as well. So curiosity is my word, and it's something that I have to be a little bit careful of, because it is one of the things that some people will say about me, but I can overuse it, so people can get a bit interrogated if I'm, letting my curiosity run rampant. So looking at the synonyms for curiosity, so all you writers out there, get your pencils ready. Think about inquisitiveness as being, the real one, and of course, curiosity being the desire to learn or know about anything, but it could be concern, it could be interest, could be eagerness, it could be intrusiveness, investigation, meddlesomeness, nosiness, officiousness, prying, questioning, or snoopiness. And interestingly, of course, curiosity could also be, the other thing is that it could be a curio, a novelty, a rarity, so a knick-knack and trinket. So I hadn't actually thought of that. I thought, a curiosity, there you go. There are some some weaker matches are just searching, mental acquisitiveness, inquiringness. I'm happy for it to be all of those kind of things. It was very interesting just to think about, other things about. It could be a wonder, it could be a thirst for knowledge, Yeah, that was about on my list. But then I remember, Darren, that I have a book by, let me just get my chart up here, called The Emotion Thesaurus, which is a writer's guide to character expression by Angela Ackerman and Becca Puglisi. And when I looked up curiosity there, because these are, good for writers, they describe the physical signals, the internal sensations, the mental responses, and the cues for acute or longer-term curiosity or cues of suppressed curiosity. So that if you are writing about curiosity but you don't want to say the person was curious, you could say something like they tilted their head to the side, they raised their eyebrows, their body posture perked up, a slow smile built up, eyebrows furrowed, they blinked, they gazed with focus, and there's a whole lot more there. It could be that their breaths hitched. These are internal sensation. They had an increased pulse. Mental responses, it could be their compulsion to detour towards something new. So if you're building a character arc, you might find that even though they were supposed to go from A to B, that they just had to go to C, D and E because there was something happening with that desire to investigate. Wonder or interest at how something works or why it's there. So you might have a character that wants to look under the hood, that wants to take things apart. And that's going to build into their strength of curiosity. Cues of long-term or acute or could be fidgeting or tics, hypersensitivity to the source of interest, pointed or even rude questions, and I may have been accused of that from time to time, and snooping or sneaking to satisfy the need to know. And if you're suppressing your curiosity, you could be keeping your eyes down, holding your hands in your lap, giving people an excuse to linger or move towards a source when really it's not really where you should be going. It could be a sidelong glance or pretending to ignore or be unaware. And curiosity may escalate to eagerness, amazement, or being conflicted. So there you go.
Well, you've got me thinking, because if fantastic is the cat's meow, curiosity could be a synonym could be cat killer.
Of
course.
Well, it did kill the cat.
That's right. Yeah. So maybe the character peered across the table with the look of a cat killer.
Yes.
Or the cat killing streak in his eye. I don't know if that would actually project curiosity. But there we go. But yes, it's amazing. All the different scenarios that the word can lead to, and the different contexts that can be used, and I like the idea of the different physical attributes or movements that can imply the curiosity as well. Very
absolutely.
Cool.
Yeah. All right. What have you got for us? Some news.
Yes.
Time for some news.
Let's jump to it. Okay, so for the news for episode 102, I thought I would just run through a couple of cool book releases by Australian authors that is due, or should I say that are due, over the next couple of months. So it's probably something I will include in the news segments as we move forward. So without further ado, I'm going to have to look up that term in a thesaurus as well. But
synonyms. Without further ado, good one.
So coming in January, so this month, we have a book called We All Lived in Bondi Then, and that's by author Georgia Blaine from Scribe, the publisher Scribe, and that is a collection of short stories, I do believe. We also have My Brilliant Sister by Amy Brown and published by Scribner. We have The Pulling by Adele Dumont, which is by Scribe, and that's actually a non-fiction book. And we have Political by Yamna Kassab, and that's coming from Ultimo. So there's a couple of books that should be hitting the shelves this month as we speak. As for the month of February, looking like quite a few good titles. We have The Great Undoing by Charlene Alsop, and that is Ultimo once again. We have Barbara Tucker, The Art of Being by Hermina Burns, and that is actually a biography, so The Art of Being, that sounds interesting. We have a book called In Bad Faith by Darcy Ehrlich, and that's from Hachette, and that is also a non-fiction, so a curious title. I might have to look into that one more. We have a book called One Another by Gail Jones. We have The Star on the Grave by Linda Morgan Royal, and that's from Affirm Press. That's a cool title, The Star on the Grave. That's definitely begs for a little bit further investigation on that one. We have a book called Chloe by Katrina Kell from Echo Publishing. We have Gawimara by Janine Liane, and that's by UQP, and that is actually a poetry collection. So there we go. We have a book called The Beacon coming in February by author P.A. Thomas through Echo Publishing, and we have a book called Gone by Glenna Thompson. Now March has got some really big titles as well. So we've got Some People Want to Shoot Me by Wayne Bergman and Madeline Dickey, and that's from Fremantle Publishing. That's non-fiction, so that title's definitely leaves some room for some questions. We have a book called Tell by Jonathan Buckley, which was the joint winner of the Novel Prize, and that's from Giramondo Press. We have Nameless by Amanda Creeley. We have a book called It Lasts Forever and Then It's Over by Anne DeMarkham. And we have a book called Dirt Poor Islanders by Winnie Dunn, and that's from Hachette. We have The Mystery Rider by Solari Gentile, and that comes from Ultimo. We have The Cancer Finishing School by Peter Goldsworthy. We have What I Would Do For You by Georgia Harper. We have a book called Compassion by Julie Jansen. We have a book called Like Fire, Hearted Sons by Melanie Justin. We have a book called Lead Us Not by Abby Lay. 36 Ways of Writing a Vietnamese Poem by Nam Le. So there we go. If you've always wanted to know 36 Ways of Writing a Vietnamese Poem, you're in luck. There's a book coming out to give you that tip. There's a book called The Work will be released by Bri Lee. That's through Alan Nudman. We have What Happened to Nina by Dervla McTiernan. Yes, we have Breath by Carly J. Metcalf. We have Pheasant's Nest by Louise Milligan. Shining Like the Sun by Stephen Orr. Appreciation by Liam Pieper. Always Will Be by Michaela Saunders. And finally for March we have Mayor's Dance by Helen Signey. So a whole heap of Australian authored books coming out. I am definitely still a little bit in love with that title, The Star on the Grave. That's a cool title. I wish I came up with that one. But yeah, so there's some book titles by Australian authors being released this month, February and March, and obviously we've got a whole lot more titles to come, which I will reveal as we go further into episodes. That is my news segment for episode 1 or 2. What have you got for us this time?
Well, 2 items really, but let me say that the first one is, it's more than one thing. So I'm just going to read to you from Literary Listings, which we know is a fabulous website, literarylistings.com, and the Literary Festival calendar for 2024 is up, which is brilliant. So I'm going to quickly run through what's happening in February. So 9th February, 3rd of March is the Perth Festival, Literature and Ideas WA. So they've got a lineup of guests. They've got Julia Gillard, Marsha Langton, Shankari Chandran, Christos Chlokas, Laura Jean McKay, I love her book, Brenda Matthews, Molly Schmidt, Rachel Johns, Natasha Lester, I've heard her speak as well, Holden Shepherd, he is fabulous, one of our favourite authors, Madison Godfrey, AJ Betts, Mark Zinning, Nikki Sava, and so many more. 10th till the 11th, if you're in Victoria, you could go and see the Festival of the Photocopier and Zine Fair. So this is a festival exclusively for zine fans, creators, readers and collectors. So look that one up, Festival of the Photocopier. If you are into bush poetry, you need to get to Orange in New South Wales on the 17th to the 25th for the Banjo Patterson Poetry Festival. Do you like Banjo Patterson poetry?
Oh, I did read a lot of it when I was younger. I'd have to refamiliarise myself with some of it, but there was definitely a beautiful rhythm, and he was definitely iconic and unique in his approach. Yeah,
I reckon Orange would be a good place to listen to it as well. All right, now if you are in Queensland, book yourself a spot in the Beyond the Book Literature Festival at Maroochydore, which is Australia's premier youth literature festival, and you've got guests Graham Ackhurst, Charlotte Barker, AJ Betts getting around, Zany Louise, who's lovely. I did a picture book course with her, Ali Marnie, who writes fabulous thrillers, Joel McKerrow, Katrina Nanastad, C.S. Bacat, Mark Smith, Oliver Nomavan, now. I'm sorry, Oliver, he writes great children's books. Bronnie Stewart and so many more. So 22nd to the 23rd in person and the 26th to the 28th virtually. So they must be going to record. And of course, this is one that I really would like to go to. GenreCon is in Brizzy, up in Bris Vegas. They have in-person and virtual events. I might see if I can go to some of the virtuals. So GenreCon is the leading conference for genre writers. And there's not many of them around since our Speculate in Victoria, decided not to go. So 23rd to the 25th of February, GenreCon in Brisbane. If you've got nothing to do on the 24th and you're in New South Wales, you might like to go to the Sydney Muslim Writers Festival. And this vibrant event serves as a dynamic platform for Muslim writers and thinkers to engage in compelling discussions, share the diverse experiences, and celebrate the flourishing literature within the Muslim community. Final one for, it's February and just sneaking into March. 28th of March to the 3rd of February is the Glen Ira Storytelling Festival, and Glen Ira is a suburb in Melbourne. The 13th annual Glen Ira Storytelling Festival is on again, and their program is launching soon. So the library service in Glen Ira is delivering that. So check that out and get yourself ready to go over to Glen Ira and look out there. So that's what's happening literary festival wise. But I did want to share, remember last time I shared a couple of our authors had won some awards. Well, I'm going to say that we've got a couple more who are looking good. So the Dan's Children's Book Award, which of course it stands for Diversity in Australia and Aotearoa New Zealand Children's Book Award, and I think we talked about these last year. And it's been created to recognise, award and celebrate diverse children's fiction. And so it's a children's book published in Australia and New Zealand, which pushes the boundaries, challenges stereotypes and celebrates diverse and marginalised people and communities. And it can include disability, culture, class, LGBTQI, race and religion. So the diversity portrayed in the book and under which the book is entered must be relevant, obvious and important to the story. So the authors don't need to identify as diverse themselves, but the work has to be sensitively and authentically written without using offensive, inaccurate, harmful and insensitive tropes and representation. So very excited to say that in picture books, The Heartbeat of the Land, written by Kathy Freeman, Coral Vass and Tanya Harricks, Coral and Tanya, who we spoke to during our Wilderness Society shortlisting, they are also shortlisted in the picture book section, which is absolutely fabulous. And in middle grade, The Rebels of Mount Buffalo by Helen Edwards, another one of our authors and one of the original 6am Oz writers, has been shortlisted as well, which is absolutely brilliant. Winners announced in March, so next month we should hear who got the final gong. So there you go. That is a whole lot of good stuff happening in the writing scene.
Yeah, definitely. There's lots happening.
But I think it's time for us to slide into the Reader's Cafe.
Yes, I think so, because there's some really cool books we want to spotlight. So let's, I'll see you in there.
Okie dokes.
So here we are in the Reader's Cafe for episode 102, and based on the really cool conversation that we're about to hear with Mr. Michael Buxton, I think my cafe is, we'll go back in time to the late 60s, and I'm just sitting there with my bare feet out on the footpath of a city cafe, and there's hippies cruising around, and there's marches against the war, and I'm just sitting there soaking it all up, and I can hear Jimi Hendrix playing and all sorts of cool stuff. What about you?
Well, I was thinking about a cafe in the city, which was in the bottom of one of those really tall buildings way up the end, Flinders and Spencer Street. And I remember sitting there and a story came to me one day. So I was waiting to have a business meeting with somebody, but I had that was when I was still drinking coffee, so I had a skinny latte there. The smell of the coffee beans was there, but I was kind of reminiscing about the train journey, and a story idea came to me. So I'm going to say a sort of sharp modern cafe with just a heavy ceramic coffee cup in front of me, with those semi-comfortable chairs around boxy kind of bits and pieces of furniture. So yeah, that's where I am.
Ah, nice.
Not 1964 at all, but anyway, that's okay.
No.
You got some stories for us to share, some of our new listings?
Yes, absolutely. Some books that authors have been so generous enough to list on the Australian Book Lovers website. So I'm going to go through a few titles. Got quite an eclectic mix today for our listeners and for our book lovers out there. So I'm going to start with a sci-fi title. And the book's called Orenda, and it is Part 2, so it's the Latitude series, Book 2, and it is by author T.S. Simons, who's got quite a bit of work on there. And Orenda is, what do you value above all else? Orenda is a First Nations Iroquois belief that all natural objects and people possess a mystical energy. It is the force that allows us to affect change in the world and manifest transformation. In this gripping sequel to the 45th Parallel, Caitlin and her husband Geo travel to Canada to take on new roles as ambassadors for the ACC. Inclusive, intelligent and aware, Caitlin proves herself a natural leader. Respected by her people, she endeavours to bridge the gap between the communities, offering them new opportunities that will benefit generations to come. But as Caitlin and Geo build their new family, an old enemy resurfaces, threatening their newfound security. Loyalties are challenged, betrayal leads to unspeakable tragedy, and the ultimate act of revenge forces Caitlin to draw on her Orenda before it threatens to destroy them both. So there we go. Ooh, what an exciting Part 2. So to the Latitude series, and that is Orenda by T.S. Simons that you find under Sci-Fi. And of course, as we mentioned on the last episode, with AI becoming so prominent, that we really want to focus on the fact that we deal with humans. So would you like to tell us a little bit about the author T.S. Simons?
Indeed, I will. And you may remember that we've spoken to Tanya on the podcast. Yes. And
I was going to say fantastic guest, but I'm going to say she was the cat's meow.
She was the cat's meow. Excellent. So Tanya's an award-winning Australian author of Scottish heritage. She lives in the Alpine region of Australia and believes in the value of integrity, sustainability and community in a world where we place greater value on possessions and people. So she enjoys posing philosophical questions that make readers think and reflect on the world we live in. So her Antipodes series addresses the question, if we gave young people the opportunity to start over, would they replicate the mistakes of the past? So she's got bachelor and master's degrees and postgrad qualifications in governance and management, and she's a company director. She's an Australia Reads ambassador, and she loves reading, travelling, mythology and snow skiing. Lives in the right spot, while attempting to live as sustainably as possible with her partner and children. Now, she is owned by a standard schnauzer, a fox red Labrador and 3 rescue cats who co-manage her household. And of course we spoke about the Latitude series, which is what Darren's described, number 2. So that's the 45th Parallel, Orenda and Bifrost. And her Antipodes series is Project Hemisphere, the space between infinity, Circle of Protection and Cess Romnia. And you might remember a couple of episodes ago that some of those names changed because Tanya got a publishing deal in the US, which was fantastic. All right. What else have you got for us? Who's next?
Okay, from sci-fi we are going to horror, and we have a new release by author Pauline Yates, and the book is called Dream Job.
See, Dream Job and horror just doesn't seem to go together, but then you think Pauline Yates, you go, okay.
Well, it's kind of like when we were talking about Utopia, how if everyone's smiling, there's something wrong. So I guess if it's a dream job, you're kind of going, where's the catch? You know? So,
yes. Too true.
So Charles Banks, an adventurous English backpacker, arrives at Murchison Station for an enticing job opportunity. But what starts as a warm welcome from owner Vern Cardwell and his wife, Martha, quickly turns into a sinister nightmare. As Charles delves deeper into his role at the remote wheat station, he uncovers the truth behind the high employee turnover and the grim fate that awaits him. Trapped and at the mercy of Vern's malevolence, Charles must navigate a treacherous web of deceit and danger, all while clinging to the hope of surviving this isolated and ominous farmstead. and that is Dream Job by Pauline Yates. So I guess you could say that's a little bit of a outback horror, which is always a really cool genre, and something that really only exists in Australia, so to a certain degree. But can you tell us this is about Pauline?
Indeed. So Pauline is a horror and science fiction author with publications in Australia and abroad, including her award-winning debut novel, which is a fast-paced science fiction inspired by a love for dark and dangerous action-adventure called Memories Don't Lie, which has a brilliant cover. I loved it. You can listen to her review about that from me. Now, her short story, The Best Medicine, won the AHWA Robert N. Stevenson Short Story Contest, was an Australian Shadows Award finalist, as you know, that's some of the horror stuff, and was translated in Italy. More fiction and poetry appear in publications including Black Hair Press, IFWG Publishing, Redwood Press, Midnight Echo, Pseudopod, Nightmare Fuel Magazine, Aurealis, Tales to Terrify, Blackheart Publishing, Metamorphosis, plus others. Now, she once mastered 2 8-word stories which were showcased on billboards around her hometown. She owns an immortal cat and she keeps too many goldfish. She loves writing at midnight when her muse is the most volatile and enjoys taking pictures of the sunrise if she wakes up in time.
Yeah, a bit of a contrast there, liking to ride at midnight, but loves the sunrise. Something tells me that's after pulling an all-nighter, tapping away on those amazing stories.
Another fabulous Australian writer. Who else? Who have you got?
Okay, well, I did promise an eclectic mix today of books, so now we're going to jump. So we've had sci-fi, we've had horror. Now we're going to jump to our genre of biographies and memoirs. This is a pretty heavy one. This is called Raw, a memoir by author Damien Linnane. I guess I put Torching That Rapist's House in the same box as the time I got married in Vegas, in the sense that it was an incredible experience, and I don't regret it at all. But that being said, I'd be very hesitant to do it again. Raw chronicles the life of Damien Linnane, born in Sydney in 1986 and initially raised by parents who met inside the prison system. When Damien was 3, his mother, a former prison welfare officer, fled a domestic violence relationship with his career criminal father. His father subsequently fabricated allegations that she had sexually assaulted Damien as a manipulative ploy to obtain temporary custody of him. A court case dragged out for several years, during which Damien was subjected to physical, sexual and emotional abuse in his father's household. An ongoing theme is how the challenges of Damien's childhood were compounded by his then undiagnosed autism, and how his trauma and mental health fueled his search for identity, alongside a desire to achieve a sense of justice for his own abuse via the proxy of other perceived perpetrators. Over the course of his life, Damien seeks brotherhood in violent right-wing gangs in Australia and later with former left-wing terrorists in Ireland. Engaged 4 times and married once in Vegas, Raw also shows Damien repeating the mistakes of his parents by forming atypical and dysfunctional relationships. The ongoing effects of his childhood trauma reach a climax when he tracks down and firebombs the home of a man who his then partner had accused of raping her. He subsequently wrote a now published novel, Scarred, by hand in prison, before turning to art as a creative outlet. Raw is written in self-reflection. It aims to show the importance of healing from childhood abuse through dialogue and discussion, and show how repressing thoughts of historical abuse only leads to further trauma for the survivors as well as those around them. So yeah, pretty heavy themes there. That book is called Raw, and it sounds like quite a, well, shall we say, a different path through life. I mean, right-wing gangs, terrorists in Ireland, married in Vegas. That's just a little bit of his life. Obviously, there was a lot of childhood mountains to climb there, and he's as we're about to find out, he's very much active in the art and literature community. So Veronica, can you share us a little bit more about Damien Linnane, the author?
Yes, indeed, because we had a little cameo from Damien in the last episode, and his bio talks about his frustration with the lack of mental health treatment, rehab and creative outlets in prison, of course, and and he turned to art and writing as that sort of constructive outlet after being incarcerated. So his first book, Scarred, as Darren mentioned, was written by hand during his sentence, but he's also the illustrator of the book This Is Ear Hustle. He's now the editor of Paper Chained, an art and writing magazine for people in prison, and he's completing a PhD at the University of Newcastle on the intersection between prison literature and healthcare in custody. And I know after his little cameo on the last episode, one of our most loyal listeners, Hayley Walsh, said who for her podcast she had spoken with Damien and said he was a fantastic person to chat with. So yeah, we'll be looking forward to chatting to Damien in the near future when we do catch up with things. So there you go, Damien Linnane and his book Raw.
Yeah, very gripping synopsis there. Well, not a synopsis, a very gripping description of a life that obviously has a lot of learning and a big journey there. So, and being someone myself who loves biography, I'm definitely going to try and get a copy of that and have a read. But again, sticking with eclectic, we're now going to go from biography and memoirs to non-fiction. So a couple of non-fiction titles. The first is called Compassionate Prosperity, and that is by author Andrea Pudding. So do you want to create a meaningful legacy with your business? Learn how with Compassionate Prosperity. This book will show you how to turn success into fulfillment and satisfaction for yourself and your business. Through inspiring stories from Andrea's podcast, Social Mission Revolution, Compassionate Prosperity will help you discover the highest purpose of your business and become an authentic influence with a legacy worth living. Discover how compassion projects in business turn success into fulfillment and satisfaction. Feel inspired to join the revolution of compassion in business. Create a meaningful legacy with your business. Compassionate Prosperity is for business leaders and entrepreneurs ready for a new purpose beyond success. Get your copy now and grow a legacy of compassion. And that is, if you hadn't caught on by yet now, Compassionate Prosperity by Andrea Pudding. Now, Andrea also listed another book on our non-fiction, which I believe is pretty much goes with this one, and that is called Compassionate Purpose. So we've had prosperity, now we're stepping into the world of compassionate purpose. So if you've questioned what is your why or the purpose of life, reading this book will take you beyond your why. Compassionate Purpose will take you on a journey to discover what true happiness and success are all about. Why am I here? What is my purpose? What is my calling? These are common questions that haunt everyone at some time in their lives. Compassionate purpose is a discovery of the calling to service. When we find a purpose greater than ourselves, we find a sense of fulfillment that can change our lives. Connecting compassion and the desire for purpose brings focus to making the difference that we all long to make, along with a sense of fulfillment and joy that creates a legacy worth living. Using compassion as your guiding principle, you will unlock the secret of living a life of joy and fulfillment. And that is Compassionate Purpose by Andrea Pudding. So, Veronica, can you let's find out a little bit about Andrea, because she's very passionate by the sounds of things.
Indeed, she is an international speaker, author and advisor, and after studying naturopathy and homeopathy, she started her business as an early adopter of the online world. She then sold the business and went into the workforce as an employee and discovered that the world needed healing, and that's where her own deep exploration led her to the social mission revolution that you've mentioned. So she champions the causes of passionate people making a difference through the world, with her podcast. Now, her writings have inspired and challenged people all over the internet for over 20 years. She's got books Awaken Stealth Leadership, Moments of Infinity, Anthology of Daily Devotionals. She's provided chapters in various books and written lots of published articles, as well as the two that are on our website now. She lives in Melbourne, amongst the gum trees, kangaroos and cockatoos, with her husband and pet cockatoo, Fella. She has 2 adult children and 2 grandchildren who keep her jumping in puddles. There you go. So have a look at Andrea's works, and if it's something that is of interest, chase up some of those things and think about leadership, social mission, all of those kind of bits and pieces, and influencing the world through social mission.
And I love that little visual she threw in there, that she's still jumping in puddles.
Yeah,
I think it's a good way to describe keeping grounded with the young, or keeping young at heart, should I say. Well, the non-fiction doesn't stop there. I've got one more title I'd like to share that a lady by the name of Ruth Woods has been so kind as to list on the Australian Book Lovers website under our non-fiction. This one is an art book. It is called Finding Form with Fibre. So Ruth Woods from Craft School Oz has produced a sculptural basketry book, and obviously it's called Finding Form with Fibre. It is a spectacular full-colour publication with beautiful photos and illustrations. The book is divided up into 3 parts. So be inspired, 14 featured fibre artists, each with their own unique style. Gather materials, a detailed section on materials, both plant fibre and recycled materials. Create your own. The final section, the reader can experiment with their own pieces by learning some basic basketry techniques and encouraged to incorporate them into their own sculpture. So yeah, that's if you're into making some basketry or learning a little bit more about sculpting with fibre, Finding Form with Fibre by Ruth Woods under our non-fiction would be the perfect place to start. And I do like the fact that it's both plant fibre and recycled materials. One of the ladies that was across the street, she has a dog called Ruby, and we pop over every now and then for a wine in the evening and hear her story. She's gallivanted all over the country of Australia for most of her life, and Tonga and all those islands. But anyway, she's an old hippie. She's a very lovely lady, really cool to talk to. Anyway, her dog Ruby had this really fun fluffy toy, and it turns out that was made by, I think she said, 16 plastic water bottles. Used water bottles. So I don't know how they do it, but I guess petroleum as a base is used for so many toys. But yes, so this fluffy toy for the dog was actually a recycled material. So yeah, I'm surprised what you can do with that. But anyway, I definitely digress there.
But you definitely digress. All right, let me tell you about Ruth. And of course, if you had been one of our subscribers, you could have won the Finding Form with Fibre book, which is just, I was so tempted to hang on to it myself. It is absolutely beautiful. But I did give it away, so, subscribe, get on the website, people, if you want one of our giveaways. Our next giveaways are also about plastic. This is also about recycling, I guess, because we've got some copies of Ned and Shane Heaton's book, Say No to Plastics, to give away. So jump on, and next one you could be in with that. But back to Ruth. She trained as a clothing designer in the UK, honing her skills with textiles and fashion companies. Once she got back to Australia, she furthered her education, graduating from the Box Hill TAFE with a visual arts diploma, then went on to complete her Bachelor of Adult Learning and Development at Monash Uni in Melbourne. So she has been teaching for over 30 years in the creative field. She describes herself as a gatherer, and part of her basketry journey, let me just try that one again. Part of her basketry journey began with creating her own garden with a keen eye for plants suitable for weaving and dyeing. And she's developed what she aptly calls her weaving pantry in her home garden. She harvests her plant fibres throughout the seasons of the year. And more recently, she's produced a beautiful book, which we've just described, Finding Form with Fibre. And of course, that further showcases her expertise in the field and her dedication to sharing knowledge. So she does workshops at Craft School Oz, and they strive to foster creativity, inspire individuals, and create lasting collections among like-minded enthusiasts. So there you go, all about Ruth Woods and her book Finding Form with Fibre.
Well, I think after all those really cool titles, we should, I'm going to scull up my coffee, step out, and...
I'm thirsty. My throat is dry. That was a lot.
Well, there's a lot of good books, and there's a lot more coming too, so stay tuned for the Readers Café on the next episode, because still lots of the books just keep coming, and the list keeps growing, and that is a beautiful thing. But time to leave the cafe and introduce the very special guest for episode 102. Okay, so out of the cafe, and so ladies and gentlemen, dear listeners of the podcast, be prepared to be swept away by a wonderful gentleman who has some really profound and moving insights into what it was like to live in the 60s when there was so much change going on, and what about the era, and in particular the year 1964, but what what motivated him to write the book, and what the way his experiences in that decade have shaped him to be the man he is today. So this is a really, really cool conversation. Like I said, grab yourself a wine, grab yourself a beer, grab yourself a coffee, grab yourself a tea, sit back, or whatever you're doing, and please enjoy the wonderful opportunity I had to chat with author Michael Buxton. Ladies and gentlemen, my very knowledgeable and distinguished guest today represents perhaps one of Australia's greatest minds when it comes to urban and regional affairs of our fair country. An emeritus professor at RMIT University and co-author of more than 20 books and author of more than 80 articles, a passionate advocate for the art of learning from the past, and a man who is no doubt celebrating right now the debut of his first fiction novel titled 1964, Michael Buxton, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Darren.
Now, it is going to be a fascinating topic of discussion, I think, tonight, having a bit of a read of the premise of 1964. But before we jump into all things philosophical and, how to change the world and fix everything that's bad, can you possibly tell our listeners just a little bit about yourself and about the journey that brought you or you've taken and up to this point, and how you've somehow managed to weave a career that's included academic, political and government roles in a world of constant change?
Yes, well, I've been writing literary works all my life, but I've never got around to publishing them. And getting on a bit, I figured it was really time to try to get some of my fiction out there. But it really, this book did raise a lot of urban issues that I've been concerned about as a politician, as a member of the government bureaucracy, and as an academic. So I've been interested in urban and regional matters for a very long time, and I think inevitably when I started to write fiction, a lot of those interests came out in a book, particularly about a city at a past time.
You mentioned that you've spent a lot of time doing literary fiction, but you've also obviously done a lot of academic writing and non-fiction writing. But I guess my question would be, do you remember, was there a specific moment in time when the proverbial writing bug gave you a bite? And what was it? Was there a sense of relief, freedom, joy at finally bringing some of your, part of your literary world into this world?
Well, I remember I sat in my English literature class when I was 17 years old, and I remember thinking all I wanted to do in life was be a poet.
Oh, wow.
I guess lots of people want that or something like that, an artist or a scientist or whatever. But that was the revelation that hit me. But all my life I've had to find time after work or during the holidays, or I did take a couple of years off in my 50s and just spent that writing literature. But I had two attempts when I first started teaching. My wife and I decided to go and teach. I was going to teach up the country and only work part-time and write, and I had an offer I couldn't refuse and stayed in the city. So and then in my 50s I had to go for 2 years. So that's what I wanted to do all my life, and I've had to fit everything in around it. But this book, I've had 3 attempts at it. Once when I was in my late 30s, and another one in my 50s when I took that time off, and I gave it up. I had a solid effort, but I didn't think I could do it. And then during COVID, I went back to it when we were all locked down, and this time it seemed to work. I just started writing it, and I went back, and after about 70 pages, I found that it had repeated much of what I'd done in the first effort I'd put into it when I was in my 30s. So I kept at it, and it seemed to happen this time. Third time lucky.
Oh, there we go. And I know, look, COVID wasn't a good time for most of the world, and I know, all across Australia, people have got pretty strong views, and a lot of people did not have a good time. But having had the pleasure and honour of being able to interview so many authors, it definitely seems as though, as a writer, the lockdowns and those periods of COVID where, things had to slow down a little bit, definitely brought us a few little hidden treasures, I think, as writers, in that time we needed. But I'm fascinated. So you said 3 attempts and first attempt at 30. And now you did say that some of the writing that you did during COVID you found was possibly, going back over the terrain that you had begun. But do you think if you had have completed the book the first time, completed the book the second time, and then completed the book the third time, how different would each book be, do you think, based on the idea of, the knowledge and wisdom you had at each point of those timeframes?
Well, I always regretted that I didn't finish this earlier. I felt that if I had, it might have led on to perhaps other things. But when looking back at it, I think I'm glad that I waited, because being older, I guess you've got more experience. You know more about a whole lot of not only events but background issues. And so I think that did help, and going back seemed a lot easier this time. I mean, writing literature is such a solitary activity, although often it can be shared in various formats. But writing generally, I think, is much more solitary than, say, academic writing. A lot of academic work now is project oriented, it's shared, you're in groups, and there are co-authoring programs, so much of the academic output now is shared and co-authored, whereas writing a literary work ends up being yours. So that was interesting, because during COVID, so many other activities we weren't able to do. And it did give time, but it also gave space and that sort of mental freedom of not having all these other tasks that we seem to be bogged down with all the time. They miraculously disappeared on the whole. So it did free up a lot of mental energy, I guess, and I was able to concentrate on this and finish it, thank heavens.
Well, absolutely, and now the world has the book. And, obviously we're talking about 1964, so this might be a good opportunity. I might just quickly read a bit of the blurb of the book, because then I'd love to jump right in, because there's, the whole concept really does invite so many questions. So for all our listeners out there, 1964 tells the story of a city lost in a world of relentless change. The year 1964 was one of transition from the certainty of the 1950s to the doubt and disruption of the modern world. A young journalist leaves the security of school and discovers an unfamiliar workplace and an escalating series of confronting experiences. As he begins university, he struggles to relate his studies to the everyday events that he encounters. As he seeks to find a place in this new world, he is torn between reporting local stories or following others who have sought grander achievements. While he seeks knowledge through his reporting and academic studies of philosophy and politics, it's through lived experiences that the young journalist discovers different notions of truth. He learns the way language determines meaning and knowledge by shaping our perceptions, and he is confronted by the meaning of truth. Do we construct our own truth, or does one immutable truth exist? So, as I mentioned, so many questions that for me, reading the premise and having a little bit of a deep dive into it, I know that you mentioned in a previous interview that you feel the book is an invitation to not just dance with nostalgia, but also to find those lessons that can be learned, as I guess what a lesson is, from such an important year or an era. So seeing that the protagonist of the book is a journalist and, taking and reflecting on, I guess, today's saturated communication where, it's almost impossible to identify what's true and what isn't, when it comes to news and information now, especially with the internet, etc. What do you think we can learn from, for example, journalism in 1964 that we can apply today to help us navigate? Do you think it was less manipulative back then in 1964 when it comes to the maybe not the journalistic side, but as far as what finally gets to the printed paper? Or do you think there were warning signs back there already and that have led to today's complete, what I feel is a state of confusion?
Well, I think there were warning signs there, and I think the whole the world of journalism was a good place to really discuss them and make them clear. The young journalist in the book, he starts fresh from school. School is a much more certain place, as a routine and a discipline. And then all of a sudden, like all of us, this young man found himself out in this really confronting world of meeting a whole series of characters and being exposed to a whole new set of experiences. And he's given two different explanations of the journalistic activity, from one from the editor and the other the sub-editor. The editor's view is that there is one truth, and that the journalist's task is to discover that truth in his or her reporting. So there's one world, it's a real world, and it can't be distorted. And if it is distorted, the journalist really has to discover the truth about that distortion and make it clear to people. And the alternative view was the sub-editor's view, who believed that the world is a chaotic place. It has a range of different types of experience. It's full of meaning that is interpreted in different ways, that people have their own perceptions, and that the journalist is really explaining one perception, the perception that seems to be the one that is most suited to the circumstance. So one is an objective view and the other one is a relative view. And this comes out, of course, all the time in the modern world. It was most dramatically shown during the Trump years, where we had this, we had these new terms that we all learned, fake news, and different. There's different truths. There's my truth and there's other truths. So this contrast between a real world and a world of interpretation, or a subjective world, has never been more relevant than today. And I guess that's one of the lessons to be learned from going back to 1964. I felt that 1964 is one of those critical years. It's a transition year, and it's a fascinating year in its own right, as I hope I've tried to show in the book. Really interesting year for what happened, but it's of great interest to us, I think, for the lessons that it shows, in particular this issue of, are we able to adequately as humans anticipate the future consequences of our action now? And when we look back to 1964, there are a whole series of critical decisions made locally and internationally by leaders, by politicians and scientists and all sorts of other people, that had fundamental consequences for the future, but that those consequences were not adequately considered. And yet people went ahead with discovery, with their attempts to do what they felt best, and they let the future look after itself. And so we have a world now that is a very different one from 1964, but with many of the consequences that I think could have been avoided had the future been adequately considered, but it wasn't. Yeah,
that's really interesting. And I'm speaking of someone who wasn't even on planet Earth in 1964. But if I look at and I do love that idea that the role of the journalist, at least when we're talking about the protagonist back in 1964, was to find that one, distinct diamond of truth, in a particular incident. And as someone who I grew up, late 70s, early 80s, there was a period there where always the journalist was the last frontier. That was the person who would risk their lives to get the truth when nobody else was going to. And that was kind of a theme that I was brought up with. But also I look at all the political world through the 80s and 90s right up till today, and it's always been my sort of understanding and belief that the people that have the power to make certain moves or make certain decisions and all those sorts of things, they can perceive to some degree the effect of their decision making or the ramifications of certain policies or choices made, whatever it might be. But I don't think they just care at some point, because as long as, they're not going to be here in 100, 150 years, so it's not relevant to them. And do you think that is there any difference in that sort of, that shallow view? Having, as I mentioned, having not been there in the 60s, or at least especially in 1964, I mean, was there any different then? Was the government in any way interested in the future? There's always talk of it, but the actions, which speaks louder than words, never seems to. I don't think they don't anticipate the changes. I think it almost appears that they can see what is going to happen, but they choose to just ignore it.
Yes, I mean that view is really entrenched today. That politicians today, for example, just will not act to fundamentally change the way we live or help us change the way we live to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, for example. I think that's a really good example. Climate change was known about in the 60s and it became really fundamentally accepted in the 80s, but we had these times when the world could have actually revisited what it was doing and made gradual changes and not had to fundamentally change what we were doing, but it didn't, and we maintained a business as usual approach, and we're now at the point where we have to make absolutely fundamental changes to avoid the worst consequences. So that was an example. But I mean, there were really interesting examples of some politicians in the 60s who did look ahead. One of the incidents in the book was that I examined was Arthur Calwell, for example, the leader of the Labor Party at the time, opposed the introduction of American bases into Northern Australia, and this is now a huge issue in Australia, as we know. It's a very contentious issue where a lot of people are, in dispute over whether we're allying ourselves too closely with America and making ourselves a target. Calwell, as the leader of the Labor Party, fundamentally opposed being too close to America in that sense, and then he went on to oppose the Vietnam War, which began in 1964 from Western involvement. He called it a very colloquial terms, a filthy, unwinnable war, and it was very unpopular at the time. He was out of step with public opinion, but he did look ahead and see that once we start wars or engage in wars, there are all sorts of unforeseen consequences. Nobody ever went into a war properly considering all the consequences, or probably they wouldn't start a war, as Putin can now testify, thinking that he was going to take over Ukraine very easily. And people find that the consequences are very difficult to predict. The Vietnam War was a classic example of that, where America thought that it could go in and solve the problems that it identified and win that war. And the war didn't really finish for America until 1974, and then Vietnam eventually fell to North Vietnam soon after. So that kind of dispute that we see today was very, very alive then, and the comparable issues that we see playing out now to the Vietnam War were in Afghanistan and Iraq, where America and Australia and some European countries went into those wars, and all they did was really cause a series of catastrophic, unforeseen results that weren't anticipated at the time. So this issue of how can we, as a species of humans, supposedly with high intelligence, and the ability to anticipate the future and understand our past, how can we avoid the worst consequences, and how good are we at doing that? And we're not very good at it at all, when it turns out. So that was the issue that I really wanted to examine by going back to 1964 and asking what lessons can we learn from that year for us today.
Well, if I was to pop a tinfoil hat on, I would probably put it out there that, you mentioned that going into war doesn't come with guaranteed consequences. There are consequences that you can't be certain of, but you can kind of guess that for most people they're not going to be good consequences. However, there must be some sort of financial benefit to certain parties at some point, and somebody gets something good out of the war, but it's never the people that are involved in the war. But that's my little tinfoil hat. But I'm really fascinated by the idea. You mentioned the Vietnam War pretty much had its origins in 1964, but you also mentioned that, or you described 1964 as a transitional year, so the transition from the certainty of the 1950s. And now the reason why I found that fascinating description, because as I mentioned, I wasn't there in 1964, definitely wasn't there in the 50s, but I've always imagined that the decade or so after the end of the Second World War would have been one of continued uncertainty, which was, so I find it, I find it fascinating that you've called it the certainty of the 1950s, especially considering 1964, of course, showed, as you mentioned, that we don't learn, or, we decided to go into war blind again. But I'm just wondering if you might be able to elaborate and illuminate for me, what do you feel were the elements of the 1950s that brought to you a certain level of certainty?
Yes, that's a really interesting point. There was, of course, a very substantial uncertainty in the world that was caused by the growth of nuclear weapons and that threat of nuclear war during the Cold War. That's absolutely correct. And this sort of hung over the world, summed up by the film Dr. Strangelove, where there was this ability of America and Russia, in particular the Soviet Union, to obliterate not only themselves but all life. And that was a background issue that everyone was aware of. But growing up in the 60s, it was a background issue. It didn't, it didn't really depress people or dominate their lives. What dominated the lives of the post-war generation of young men and women who came back from that war and started families in the late 40s and then saw them grow during the 50s was this belief that life was always going to get better. There was this total acceptance of this philosophy of progress, that everything would get better. It might be gradual, but gradually people became more affluent, they became better off, more comfortable, that illness and disease would be overcome, and that eventually so would conflict. And that's exactly what happened. People did become more affluent and more settled in the 50s. The 50s began in the Western world, and certainly in Australia, with people using ice chests, no sewerage. Ice was brought in every week. There was a certainty about that, and gradually people were able to buy refrigerators, washing machines, and eventually cars. Most people didn't own cars in the early 50s, and gradually people were able to buy cars. Most people travelled by public transport. It was a completely different world. So there was this belief in this ideal of progress, and I think the interesting issue to me about 1964 was that it was a fundamental transition year. I think the year 1964's uncertainty began with the election of President Kennedy as President of the United States. And he, in lots of ways, he was this young man with a young wife, and he symbolised this belief that everything was going to get better. He was able to anticipate future problems. He solved the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he was going to get on with social change and reform. And this young couple they symbolise this belief coming out of the post-war generation of that everything can get better. And here they were illustrating that, and then he was assassinated, and that symbolised the end of that era, that belief, that hope, that expectation. And what was ushered in was a much older man as President Johnson, and a series of catastrophic mistakes that quickly flipped us over to doubt, uncertainty, and increasing disruption. And not only focused particularly on the Vietnam War, because that led to almost revolution in the United States, but it led to fundamental change across the world, increasing inflation and so on, and many of the problems that we've never been able to get rid of. So I think that year was, to me, fascinating as a transition year, and it repaid careful study to actually see what were the factors that characterised that transition, and what was the doubt and the uncertainty that we suddenly flipped into from this more settled belief in progress that characterised the 50s.
Wow. So I'm guessing it must have been, a case of the 50s representing that proverbial storm having passed, and finally the calm weather coming, and the ability to rebuild and hang up the washing, and sunshine and beautiful blue skies. And lo and behold, 1964 comes, and there's another storm cloud on the horizon. And I can imagine that's got to pack a bit of an emotional punch if you've just started to enjoy that certainty and that sense of settling down after the world being upside down for so long. And was it similar, do you think, in Australia as much as it was in America, in the sense
very, very, very much so. And as an example, there was very high home ownership in the 50s, 60s. Young people, when they left home, when they married, they could afford to live in the suburb they were brought up in. It's almost unheard of today that could happen. So people were able to expect that they could continue the kind of life that they had been leading. And yes, that change certainly, I think, was relatively sudden. But it was the 50s is often criticised as a boring time, where there were no new ideas coming out. And, Robert Menzies in Australia was the Prime Minister and allowed the country to go to sleep. And that's far from true. As one example, I can still remember the entire street coming out and standing at the front gates, all down the street. The whole families came out to watch Sputnik come over. He was this symbol of the growth of science from the Soviet Union.
Wow.
Putting a satellite in the sky, and you could see it. You could see it go over and glinting in the night sky. This satellite was coming across the sky, and people were absolutely amazed at this. And this was this belief in science.
What a time. What a moment in time.
And there was this belief in scientific growth and knowledge. And naive in a lot of ways, a naive acceptance of it, but it was far from a boring time. All these massive social changes were happening, but there was this belief that, Sputnik's up there, there's a satellite, it's put up by the Soviet Union, but we're going to benefit as well because we'll be able to do the same and we'll share knowledge. So one of the fundamental elements of this belief in progress was an acceptance of the benefits of modern science, of course, and this is examined in detail in the book, right through from the original conception of the standard scientific view of an objective world, most famously described by Newton, where everything could be predicted, the motions of the planets and the stars would be predicted with great certainty. And by the 20th century, and certainly by the 1960s, we had come into quantum physics and the relativism of Albert Einstein and a series of new discoveries that challenged fundamental beliefs, such as one event follows another in a linear way. So all our assumptions were upset and fundamentally summarised by Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which said that we can't know the location and the speed of an object at the same time. So this sort of growth of uncertainty in something that seems so certain, standard science, really started to take root from the 60s. And 1964, a lot of these new discoveries and new theories were actually published. So 1964 certainly was a transition year that really was a prelude to fundamental change.
Absolutely. That's a really good point, because here I am, I've sort of been musing on the year from a political standpoint and obviously the social aspects of it. It never occurred to me to think about the scientific elements and the scientific landscape back then, because it must have been one, like you said, from the transitioning from the 50s to the 60s, where not only obviously was science moving at a fast pace, science does in general move at a fast pace, but I'm guessing it would be fair to say that back then there would have been a bigger impact as new theories or new applications of science emerge, as opposed to today. We may just, may come down in technology we're already using, but whole fundamental foundations of science were changing. That would, I guess, would have to make things a little bit unsettled when it comes to even simple things like your textbook at school could be obsolete within a 6-month period or 12-month period.
Yes, and I think this was carried through into the media. That's what fascinated me about using the media as a way into this change from certainty to uncertainty. The media, for example, in reporting all these great scientific and other changes and wars and all the other elements of this change, the media itself was changing. But in 1964, the media seemed to be infallible. It was incredibly powerful. Newspapers had an entrenched position. They could make or break governments. Rupert Murdoch was just beginning the rise of his own empire, and the media just simply didn't anticipate, or most people in the media didn't anticipate the challenge that were going to come. So this young reporter goes to work and he types on a typewriter that was about 30 years old. He gives the copy to a linotype operator, which typed it onto molten metal, and it was laid out in the traditional way that had been followed for centuries and printed. And now a reporter just presses a button and we have a digital world. Not only that, but the very role of the media is now under threat to the point where it may not exist any longer in the way that it has. Social media is taking its place, and so we have this individualization of experience. The media was based on the knowledge of a journalist. The journalist did the investigation, did the reporting, shared that knowledge, and the newspaper or the other form of media came up with an interpretation of it that everybody thought was true. And now we have individual truth, we have subjective truth, we have truth being what we describe in our social media posts. It's come right around from this original idea of objective knowledge, one reality, one truth, to multiple truths and multiple interpretations. And of course, the ultimate expression of this perhaps is artificial intelligence. And the big issue there is that if artificial intelligence progresses, as it is now commonly predicted to actually be able to manipulate all the information that we gain, manipulate our knowledge and manipulate us and determine the future for us, and not only that, but control us and prevent us from altering what this all-knowing artificial creature that we've established can control. So the world has come a long way, but it really does go back to that difference in 1964 between an objective and a subjective world.
Such an interesting contrast, isn't it, from the style of reporting and transmission of information then to today. And you're right that for so long the journalist role was to sort of get in there where we couldn't get a voice from, to go to dangerous locations or to infiltrate certain circumstances and environments, and to follow the story, to get to the heart of the story, so that there could be, and that journalist then represented, that supposedly neutral voice that's actually at ground zero and then can project back the information. And that's come such a long way to change, because now, if there's, for example, an event that were to happen, within seconds, there are people on the ground there that can transmit their objective and subjective experience. So in effect, we've got the same concept of journalists being there, but now everybody can be journalists in the sense of reporting what's happening at a very specific moment in time. But saying all that, today, if I decide to, if I were to finish this interview and want to look at some news, and I want to be confident that the news I'm reading comes from a neutral standpoint and will educate me to the point where I can be confident the information is correct, with the whole world of information at my fingertips, I have zero idea where to go, because I can no longer trust anything on the computer, on the internet. Likewise, if I go, I'm not going to trust any mainstream television either, or to a certain point, even radio. There are certain mediums and certain programs and certain avenues that I can have quite a bit of confidence in, but nothing with absolute confidence, because more and more I say you, but I say we can find stories that have just been copied and pasted from another source, which were actually copied and sourced from another source. And to the point where I just wonder how much journalism really is playing a role today. And you did mention artificial intelligence, and having played around with it a little bit, it goes without saying that we're at a point even today that you could read an article that is news that may not have even been written by a human being, and we wouldn't know. And that's where it gets tricky. But then I think, okay, when I was growing up, and so I'll use Adelaide as an example, where I grew up as a young kid. There was predominantly 2 newspapers in the city at that time. So when I look back now at that time, the journalistic integrity was there, but as far as the information getting to me from the journalist, that transitional period, that part where it goes through that molten lead typing machine and out on the streets with the advertising, it could manipulate our way of thinking so easy then too, because there was no way to cross-reference or know that we might have been being manipulated with false or at least deceptions of the truth. So it's very slippery, isn't it? Is it a case of the more things change, the more they say the same, or do you think there was more honesty in the information, the news we got back then as to today, or do you think today we've got access to find more honest truth or more honest representations than before?
Well, we look at this in great detail in the book through the kind of reporting that the young reporter has to do. And it quickly becomes apparent that all news is selected. The judgments are made in what is news, and once it is selected, then there are different interpretations of what to emphasise. So the question is there any such thing as an objective news? And when we look at the different interpretations, the angles, the orientation of news, one newspaper can present a fact from one angle, and another one can present the same fact with a completely different interpretation or conclusion. So I think that issue has always been out there. And this young reporter, to me, the interesting part of the reporter's work in this book is that, you know, he's just started his first job and he wants knowledge. That's the point of his year, and he wants it through his reporting, but he also is going to university from school and studying philosophy and politics, and in his philosophical studies he gets behind all these issues and really starts to try to understand what is a fact, what is interpreted, and looks at the philosophical basis, all the different philosophical positions, in brief, of course, and then relates them to everyday experience and his reporting, and spends the year on a journey, as we all do. And his journey is a journey towards knowledge, or the attempt to find knowledge through his reporting and through his university studies. And it's interesting that the university experience, even itself in those days, symbolises just how far we've changed as a society. He went to Monash University. That was Melbourne's second university. Most Australians, cities only had one university at the time. Monash started with just a few hundred students a few years earlier, and by 1964 still only had a couple of thousand students. University experience was only for a minority of people. Most people didn't go to university or any form of tertiary study at all. And I think, you know, there was this sense that universities were a way of discovery. They were a way of explaining to a few people who inevitably ended up an elite, because the people who got university educated ended up in leadership positions, and there was this belief that would lead them to make wise decisions, drawing from that humanist tradition. And that in itself is a naive belief, because very often they made very silly decisions. They didn't make wise decisions. They got us into wars, for example, and they didn't anticipate future consequences. So he, you know, the whole relationship between learning and a university is a very important part of the book as well.
Probably should be said, or at least I'm going to hazard a guess here. I suspect that the experiences of the protagonists in this book might have a little bit of a basis in your experience in 1964. So am I right to guess that you were actually a journalist at one point back in there?
I was. I went from school to a local newspaper, Standard Newspapers it was called. It's a forerunner of the Leader Group, and they had their headquarters in Cheltenham. They published 12 local papers, and they were huge. And it exposed me to the sort of issue that's looked at in the book. How important is local news compared to the big story that everybody seemed to want to get out into the international sphere? I mean, the book goes and examines some of the famous international journalists who did go overseas and report wars, one in particular. And so this young reporter had this constant question: should I stay in a local paper with local news? How important is that compared to these huge stories about war that he could be over reporting the Vietnam War as some of the famous journalists did in the Second World War. So this was the big issue, and it just again shows how important local papers were. I mean, they kept people in touch with each other. They allowed local politicians to be scrutinised. Local councils were really put under the hammer, along with a lot of local institutions, and people were able to keep in touch from local weddings to what was going on, and most local papers now are gone. I think when they went, we realised just what they meant and how important they were. So this was the world that confronted this young man, and certainly I drew from my own experience. The book really revolves around a dialogue and experience between two young men. The journey that they went on wasn't just the journey of 1964. It was this journey to and from work, and to and from the railway station to university studies, and then back home. So it was an epic of its own. It was an epic of the ordinary person, the kind of epic that we all lead. An epic in literature is a journey of discovery and self-discovery through great events, where the hero embarks on a journey of discovery and knowledge. And the journey of discovery and knowledge of these two young men and the other people in the story was one that was ordinary, but it involved more miles, more travel than the great epic heroes did. But it was just an ordinary life. In a way, everybody's life is epic. So it was really a story about ordinary events that this young reporter was reporting on and experiencing himself. Not a story of great events, exceptional people, but a story of ordinary people living in a city and in suburbs.
That raises an interesting point. That we're so quick to assume that the big journey, the exciting journey, the hero's journey, these big adventures sort of represent the pinnacle of what it is to have a journey. But realistically, each of us have our own unique journeys, and it could extend no further than the borders of a local town. But amazing and earth-shattering things can happen. Depending on, you might have an incredible journey just diving into books and, exploring philosophical realms. It could be, a number of things. So, it's definitely fascinating the way you've chosen to utilise your experience and utilise a journalist. And that's got to be just the perfect protagonist to be viewing the year 1964 and all the transitions. And you brought up a really good point. I've never considered it that way. When you said, in the early 60s or even late 50s, that universities were more a case of catering for people that did want to extend their learning more than anything else, because as you mentioned before, it was a time when anybody could go out and begin to afford their own home, etc. So, what would be the point of university? And of course, today it's almost like without university, you're putting yourself behind the eight ball. So that the consensus seems to be out there in the Netherlands, but whether it's true or not is another matter. So, but I was really also speaking of that journey that the characters take, and like you said, it was a normal journey, but just as profound as what we all go through. But as part of your description in your book, you did say that language determines meaning and knowledge by shaping our perceptions. Now, without giving too much away of how you might discuss that concept in the book, obviously that particular line really grabbed my attention. Do you think that are you speaking, when you say that language determines meaning and knowledge by shaping our perceptions, is that based on, are you speaking from an educational perspective in the sense that what we learn and how we feel about a particular packet of knowledge is shaped by the way it's communicated to us? Or are you delving a little bit more towards, the true sense of the word meaning, in the sense of, our experience of the emotions, sights and sounds of the world? They can also be distorted based on, preconceived assumptions or maybe expectations that have been programmed to us through language, through knowledge that we've been learning.
Yes, that's a key part of the book, and it related to the view of the world, of the dichotomy between whether there's a real world or whether we construct our own experience. And language is clearly a vital part of that. We are the only species with a language as complicated as our own. There are other forms of language, but our language is immensely complicated. But through the language, through the general terms that we use, we do interpret the world, and the words we use and the way we construct them in a language help shape our own experience. Language both expresses experience, but it helps shape our experiences in all sorts of interesting ways. And so we look at this in the book from the disputes between scientists and and humanists, and the view that the way we see the world is really encapsulated in the languages we use, right through to the very words we use can actually, in a way, let us see certain things and not other things. So fundamentally, a reporter, of course, uses language. That's the key tool, and this young reporter comes to understand what language is doing and how critical it is in explaining experience. I guess one of the other key and perhaps final point is this issue of in using language. Not only is this a story of common experience, not great exceptional events, but the ordinary lives that are led by most of us, but it's the story also of a lost city. And Melbourne really is just symbolic of the type of change that was going on through Western cities in particular at the time, in America, Australia, Canada, and to an extent in Europe as well. Melbourne was a totally different city, as most Western cities are today, very different from the cities of 1964. It's interesting that I used to talk to students at RMIT in my lectures and say there were no such things as shopping malls or big box centres in 1964. There were no freeways. Very few people had cars. There were no high-rise residential towers except for a couple of Housing Commission apartment blocks. And now we look at our cities in Australia today and they're fundamentally different. They've taken a different tack. They're much more complicated and increasingly moving to chaotic situations that are going to be very difficult to live in the next 20, 30 years. There's an argument for saying that we are moving to a time of disruption and that the future city is going to be a very difficult place to live. But Melbourne was a very easy place to live in 1964, and I think that summarises a lot of change, but it is a lost city. We had a city then that was really very similar to the one in the 1890s, when Melbourne was seen as a jewel of the Western world. It was one of the most beautiful cities on the planet, and most of that has now been pulled down and turned into high-rise towers that really don't have that attraction. So that was a fundamental illustration of change, I think.
Wow, what a tragic but kind of beautiful as well way to describe Melbourne. And again, you're raising something I'd never even thought of, and that is that a transition also means the loss of a city. Because at first when you said a lost city, I was thinking, where are you going with that? Because Melbourne's definitely still here, but obviously the Melbourne of today is a far cry from the Melbourne of the late 50s, early 60s. And something tells me ambience would play such a huge role. As you were describing the city with, no freeways and minimal traffic, and it's almost like a fairyland, really, isn't it?
Well, many of the cities on the planet retain their history and their heritage character. And it's interesting that a lot of the politicians that govern Australia are very happy for our cities to be pulled down, but every holidays they can get the opportunity. They get on a plane and go over to the old European cities and enjoy the ambience and the heritage character of places like Paris and Prague and
funny
so
that. Yeah.
No, it's funny that, isn't it? But that's what's happened to our cities. And again, it's an illustration that people have said to me, like, what would have happened if the politicians of the 60s had made sure that the old Melbourne, just in the CBD even, had been retained. Imagine the tourism benefits from that. People would have come from all over the world to see this remnant of marvellous Melbourne, still existing as it was, not as just in little pockets. And the benefits of that retention would have been massive. And many other cities saw that, and they made sure that they retained what was valuable to the citizens, and that people every day enjoy the benefits of that. But unfortunately, we've lost a lot of it. But it is another illustration of the failure to anticipate future needs, and it is a shame. But we're stuck with it now, and I think we have to learn from that and try to draw the right conclusions for the future to ensure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past and we move to a better future.
Yeah, what a way, what cost has it come to give such a gift of education to the rest of the world about what not to do to a beautiful city. Not to say, of course, Melbourne isn't stunningly beautiful now, but yeah, it must have come with a bit of a stinger's tail to know that the mistake they made there was used as a word of warning or caution for other cities. Obviously, the premise for the book, it isn't just a garden, but it's a whole rainforest, or at least maybe two rainforests of fertile ground for thought. And we could go down these rabbit holes forever because it's absolutely fascinating. But one question I really wanted to ask you, Michael, how did you, on a personal level, find the experience of writing the book? I mean, did you mentioned this is the third time, and this time it was the one that stuck. But this third time, did you find yourself, swimming in emotional waters again, maybe waters that, had been still for a long time, and rediscovering memories? Or was it more of a case of being able to revisit your, journalistic philosophical musings of 1964 with a 21st century hindsight? Was it one or the other? Was it a mixture of both? Was it exhilarating putting it together, or did you find a sense of melancholy at a time that maybe was, very special for you that might not come back? What was that process like, writing 1964?
Well, it was actually a really enjoyable experience, I must admit. I got into a routine of waking up at 3:30, almost on the dot every morning, and writing down the next day's structure and ideas, and then going back to sleep and getting up at 7:30 and starting work at 9 and working away on what I'd written down at 3:30 in the morning. And I followed that routine, I guess, for about 8 months. Just almost every night that happened.
Well, I've heard a number of different, methods to writing and people's approach and their little, tricks and tips. But that is the first time I've heard of someone getting up at 3:30 just to jot down the plans for the day and then going back to sleep. Was that an alarm clock thing, or was it just something that naturally came?
It just happened. I was helpless to prevent it, so I just went with it. And as I'd work through the day's writing, it was a bit of a revelation to me about what would come up, and it was very interesting to delve into the memories that would come forward. But once I got a structure, then I was able to work through the year. And the structure I adopted was this idea of the epic of the ordinary, that I was really writing a story about how ordinary life is epic in its own way, but that it was a structure based on the idea of repetition and variation. So there was, a repeated structure of these two young men going through the same processes every week, and often every day, but there were always interesting variations. And of course, this is what life is. We get up in the morning at the same time we go to work, or we start work. When people were going into work and not working at home as much, you leave at the same time, get the same train or drive the same route, socialise with the same people on the same evenings after work often. We follow a routine that is repetitive, but we vary it, and it's varied often by factors outside our control, and these are the factors that make life interesting. So the writing process was really following that process of living, and it was very enjoyable. I was really intrigued about what was going to come up every day.
You've got me having a strange image of when you're a kid and either it's your birthday the next day or it's Christmas, and you just can't sleep because you're so excited about unwrapping that present the next morning or getting to the celebrations. And I've just got this weird imagery of you tapping into that inner child, Michael's inner child, being so excited to get the story down that your body's not letting you sleep and getting you up and getting you excited. That sounds like a pretty epic way to keep motivated. The fact that you can't slow that motivation down, that's amazing.
Well, the good thing is, I think, when we make notes to ourselves, once you make the note, you can push it away and go back to sleep, which was great, So, no, but it was an interesting experience. I was really interested in what was going to arise from the process, and I just let it come following that structure over a period of a year, and gradually it got there. It took a lot of reworking, of course, once I got the first draft. So I had 3 major rewrites, but finally was pretty happy with it. So it did take a bit more rigour after the initial writing experience. So
the first draft's never going to be the one, is it? It takes a whole lot of machinations to get the final product there. But I'm curious. What do you think the young journalist Michael Buxton in 1964 would think about the book 1964 if you could send that through time?
Interesting. I'm not sure. I think he'd probably think it was a reasonable record of events in 1964, and of the intellectual discoveries through the studies of philosophy and so on. So I think I tried to show what was learned in that period, and the knowledge that came out of living in that year. But critically, what couldn't be done then was what I could do now. Looking back, I could look back and write into the book, allusions and references to now and to the future in ways that, of course, you can't do, or it's very difficult to do so long ago. So I was able to. But it was really a process of really inviting the reader, who knows we know what we know now, to look back to 1964 and to assess what was happening then, and to make a judgment about not only what happened, but what could have happened, and also what needs to happen now from the learnings out of 1964. So that's the critical time frame, now and then, and what we can learn by looking back and applying it to the future.
That leads nicely into a question I have written down, a bit of a fun one. So if, as a journalist in 1964, you had access to Doctor Who's TARDIS and managed to zoom straight to 2023, what journalistic piece of advice do you think would be a good offering to the world here in 2023, and with all the crazy state of play that we are all part of? Is there anything that pops to your mind that maybe, without, not to give anything away from the book or anything that's in there, lessons that are definitely written in concrete there, but yeah, a bit of fun if you popped out of the TARDIS from 64, had a look around and went, what is going on? What would be something you could jot down on a notepad and leave at the bar before you jump back in the TARDIS?
That's interesting, isn't it? Because over a lifetime, change seems to be gradual and so slow. But really, there are so many fundamental differences between now and 1964, and yet it's all part of a lifespan. I think a person from 1964 would be staggered if they were suddenly transported to 2023, staggered in with the physical changes that they saw around them, but more than that, to the fundamental processes, the way the society works. The internet, for example, and factors like that, the huge advances in medical science, satellite, technology, it just seems never to stop. And I think the fundamental skill that you'd want somebody from 1964 to have would be that ability to adapt, to be transported to another time and to be able to function effectively and to adapt. And, we see this in popular cinema, Back to the Future. It's this kind of issue adaptation. We look that's examined in great detail in the book by looking at evolutionary theory and how well we as a species can adapt to change. But that would be the fundamental skill I think that we need to have, that ability to adapt to fundamental change, and that's what we need for the future. We need that ability if we're going to survive as a species.
It's crazy when I think about it now. I really appreciate that insight, and I think that's a beautiful answer. And it made me think. I'm thinking, okay, 20 years. So let's go back to 2003. Now that period from 2003 to 2023, I can't see that many aspects where I've found myself being faced with this like existential requirement to adapt or fall to the wayside. I've found little things being upgraded perhaps and a few little new additions to sort of modern everyday life, but otherwise adaptation, well, okay, I went from, I guess, normal TV to Netflix, but that's hardly a change of anything but choice. It's still the same broadcast to its shows. But to think 1945 to 1965, 20-year period, and the all the different facets of adaptation that were required then, I think that brings nothing but absolute truth to your premise that adaptation, the ability to adapt, is so important, because far out there must have been so much to adapt over that period from 1945 to 1965. And I don't know, I'm not a great historian. I know the years that I've been on the earth. I'm just trying to think if there was another 20-year period beyond from after that might even match with so many challenges to the day-to-day life and the different swings, the shifts, the political, the global, tensions. It's massive 20 years to have to adapt to, isn't it?
It has been. I mean, one simple example of this issue is getting a job, is careers. In 1964, everybody came out and got a job, and there were jobs waiting in very traditional occupations, from trades through to public service to all sorts of other other disciplines and careers, and everybody made their choice and got a job. Many people stayed in those jobs for the rest of their lives, or at least not in that particular employment circle, but in that type of employment. They got a skill or an education and followed it through. Now, today, the job situation is absolutely, it's fundamentally different. It's unrecognisable from what it used to be. For a start, manufacturing has disappeared, and we were shocked as a nation to find during COVID that we make virtually nothing anymore.
Oh yeah.
So all that manufacturing went, and it's not only very difficult to actually move into a career that is going to be one that is going to remain in any sense of the form that you choose today. The career is going to change fundamentally, but it may disappear. Not only that, but permanent jobs, a very different situation. Most people did have permanent full-time jobs. Now there's a huge emphasis on part-time jobs and on temporary jobs. The job market is fundamentally different. It creates huge uncertainty in young people, and it leads to problems down the track. For example, in ever being able to borrow money from a bank if you don't have the kind of economic security that a bank demands. So all these factors have just fundamentally changed the way our society works, almost unrecognisably, and this calls for incredibly complicated skills in young people in somehow finding ways around these problems to adapt to uncertain futures and an unknown future world. So that illustrates very much the whole premise of the book. In this move from certainty to uncertainty creates a huge challenge for everybody today, that people have to adjust to and find ways to cope with, and it's very difficult. It's not easy.
Starting very much to sound like your book 1964 could be an excellent survival manual as we go through the terrain of this digital future. Because, like I said, some things, there's certain themes to all the disruption and change and stuff that have been, they're probably cyclical. The logistics are different, but the underlying principles are the same in the sense of moving to an uncertain platform. So definitely reason, ladies and gentlemen, to go and grab a copy of 1964, because you've got me absolutely fascinated. I'm definitely going to find some time and dive into those pages. But I'm wondering, now that the 1964 is out there, and you've obviously been a part of so many different academic non-fiction books, and you did say that your fiction literature is something that you've been working on in the background for a long time. Are you working on anything new? Is this have you found yourself bounding out of bed at 3:30 in the morning with a new idea? And is there any secret new manuscript in the works?
Yes, I've got some more ideas. There are 3 books in a kind of series that I want to publish about this, around this theme of ordinary life. This book and two volumes of short stories, if I can get them out. But no, I'm moving in other directions now, so I hope to have a few more years where I can spend most of my time writing, Darren. So I'm looking forward to it. If I can get another 5 or 6 years at it, I'll be very happy.
Well, considering your muse wouldn't even let you sleep, I suspect 5 or 6 years is going to be nothing for your muse. That's easy. That's a guarantee. I think you'll be getting a few books out yet. And what about for listeners out there who are really fascinated by the title, no doubt going to grab a copy of the book, but what about if they wanted to follow and see what you're up to, and maybe just learn a little bit more about you, or perhaps learn about what's happening in 1964? Do you have anywhere people can follow you or see what's going on?
There is I've got a reasonable presence on LinkedIn, for example, or through RMIT. My email presence there and all my contact details can be gained through RMIT, and other methods like that. So yes, there are ways to communicate, and I welcome any ideas and communication. That would be great if people wish to do that through those methods. It'd be terrific. I'd love it.
You may be inundated yet, and I know I'll be reaching out again soon, because I would love to keep chatting with you further, and I'd love for you to be a guest on our Writers Lounge and find out how things are going with the release of 1964, and definitely want to chat about some of these short stories and new journeys that go beyond 1964 with the books. But in the meantime, I just want to thank you so much, Michael, for being a part of the Australian Book Lovers podcast and for taking the time to chat with me. It's just been absolutely awesome. And like I said, I could talk for hours, because some of the things you've told me has completely blown my mind and made me look at things in a completely different light. So I can only imagine the same can be said for the pages of the book. But thank you so much for chatting with me, and I really appreciate it, and absolutely wish you nothing but absolute success with the release of 1964.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Darren.
Absolute pleasure.
So thank you, Michael. Great interview, really good information, really good memoir. And let me just say that I did buy Michael's book for my nephew for Christmas. So I did mean to, before we chatted about Michael's, had him on the episode, I did mean to ask Ewan what he thought of the book, but I'll chase that up for another day.
Well, there you go. Potential review in the cards there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but no, Michael, thank you so much for the chat. Thank you for your patience for the interview to come out. We are chasing our tail a little bit, but still, what a time to be alive, and what a beautiful way of looking back and recording your thoughts and the way that those times moved you by writing such a beautiful book. So congratulations, and I'm sure it's not going to end there. But what is coming to an end is episode 102, and of course what that means is we need to quickly talk about quotes. So What quote did you pick for this episode, Veronica?
I picked 2, but I'm going to just choose one. And what I'm going to give you is one from Albert Einstein.
Oh, he's always good for a quote.
Always good for a quote.
Assuming they're real, like, for example, you can't read anything on the internet, Albert Einstein. Oh, sorry, you can't believe anything on the internet, Albert Einstein. Those look pretty funny, but anyway.
All right, here we go. The most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion that stands at the cradle of true art and true science.
Very profound, very insightful.
Yeah, I really like that. The most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious. Yeah, it stands at the cradle of true art and true science. Yeah,
and that raises an interesting point too, because mystery plays such an important part in life. And when you think about it, we spend a lot of our time trying to demystify our existence, rather than seek out mystery. I'd have to admit for myself, most of my reality at the moment isn't really based around any mystery, whereas I need some more mystery. I suppose when I go diving in the waters, that's a bit of a mystery, or obviously contemplating the stars when I'm out in the bush, that's always a mystery. But it's just something that I think it needs a bit of a balance. We spent so long demystifying. It might be fun adding some mystery.
Yes, and really that was the kind of segue from curiosity. When I think about it, it's also the segue from your word fantastic. There we go. Yeah. What is your quote?
Well, I was inspired by the idea of, how times can change, as inspired by the conversation with Mr. Buxton and through the 60s. So my quote is a very short one. It's from Lao Tzu, and it is, if you do not change direction, you might end up where you are heading.
I've heard that one. That is a really good quote. It's a really good quote.
It kind of gives you a light. You don't know if you've just been slapped or kissed. So and then when you work it out, it's kind of both. But I like that. If you do not change direction, you might end up where you are heading. So there we go. I'll leave it up to you, dear readers, how you might interpret that for yourself. And apply that to your own life. And it's an interesting philosophical statement there. I like it. That'd be perfect for a coffee mug or a T-shirt.
Indeed it would be. Absolutely. Yes, of course. And if you want any Australian Book Lovers merchandise, such as a coffee mug or a T-shirt, you can get that either straight for the link on our website on the merch page, or you can go to Redbubble and type in Australian Books, and you will find all of our little mascots and all of our logos, and you can get that on a T-shirt or a coffee mug. If you want to support us, the podcast, you can jump on there, and we'd be most happy for any little offerings that you might have, which help us get the podcast on the air. If you're an author, jump onto the website and list your book with us, and you might get on the, the interviews are thick and fast, so that is getting a little bit trickier, but certainly we will spotlight your book and talk about it on the podcast. And readers, support Aussie authors and jump on there and read Aussie books, which of course I've just stuck in the byline. What are we going to do for our farewell this episode?
Well, I know it's a cliche, and I'm probably butchering a lot of people's memories definitely not butchering my memory because I didn't exist, but I thought maybe we could just be like far out hippies, man, in the 60s, and but before we do that, and this is copyright 2024 Darren Cousin Co, I was thinking marrying together the technology that brings us like your Kindle Paperwhite but putting that on a coffee mug which connects Bluetooth so that you can set it up, pick your subject matter, and then it will, every day you wake up, your coffee cup will have a different quote on it. Perfect.
Oh, yes. Go.
All right. You heard that idea first.
Copyright Darren Cousin Co.
Now, so maybe we can be hippies and, far out, man. We're just trying to tell the people. So,
okay.
Well, let's,
when you're ready.
Let's head on to marching down the streets. Let's go.
Peace, love and joy, and pass me the couscous and all those kind of things, because what do you think, mate?
say, man, that sugar cube was a little bit strong. I'm seeing goldfish up in the sky, but I do reckon we should tell the people, man, you could read more Aussie books. And stick to one sugar in your coffee, man. That's heavy cubes. Thank you, everybody, for putting up with that really cringeworthy effort by myself and the cliche.
It's good.
Yeah.
It's us.
Thanks.
Yeah. Take care and bye for now, everyone.
See you at episode 103.
Blood Fever by Laurie Bell. Bell continues to surprise and delight with this new sci-fi action thriller. I've read several of her books now, and her storytelling is brilliant. I don't know why I was surprised to see another very unique voice in this new subgenre. Blood Fever is fast and action-packed. Our three main protagonists are definitely oddballs, each with their quirks, tragedies and modus operandi, all fabulously flawed and thrown together in a high-pressure and stressful situation. I was amazed at how much of their backstory Bell managed to thread into the story without interrupting my rapid page-turning or slowing of the plot. I really enjoyed the gradual unpacking of the crime. Just when you think you have it sorted, another layer and more clues throw you deeper into an unexpected story twist. The world building was excellent, with the multi-species, multi-world universe slick and full of great tropes. I'm looking forward to more from the Steyr private investigation team. A great read.
Let's meet again. Where magic happens.
Australian Book Lovers acknowledges First Nations peoples and recognises their continuous connection to country, community and to culture. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and honour the sharing of traditional stories passed down through generations. We're committed to a safe and inclusive welcome for authors and readers of all cultures and backgrounds, including people of LGBTQIA+ communities and their families.